why don't we get started with our usual land recognition, and then we can get into the conversation.
We can do that for sure. Let's just bring the slide deck up here. And as Craig said, it's always our, there we go. It's always part of our morning to acknowledge that the campus of SAIT, based in Calgary, is situated on our traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy. Today, that encompasses the Indigenous people of the Treaty 7 region, the Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai, the Tsuut'ina, the Stoney Nakoda, and the Northwest Métis homeland. SAIT also acknowledges all of the people who make their homes in the Treaty 7 region of Southern Alberta. For all of us, this traditional land is a place where we walk in the footprints of the Métis people.
Perfect. Thanks, Jenny. And so good morning, everybody. As we've been chatting here and folks are rolling in, you've heard us mention this a couple of times, but just out of curiosity, if this is your first time joining us, do us a favor and just throw the number 1 in the chat. If it's your second or more time, it's not great language, but that's, I think you know what I mean. Throw a 2 into the chat. Lots of 1s and 2s. Fantastic. It's great to see. So we know everybody has found the chat button at the bottom of Zoom. Right next to it, you'll find the Q&A button. And as Jenny mentioned earlier, if you have any questions as we go through and we're dealing with this topic of performance today, please do throw them in the chat. You know, we get so much out of the conversation. We have some guided points that Jenny and I try to get to, but you know, we really want to try and build off of what you're bringing to this morning as well. So feel free to throw those questions into the Q&A and we will answer them. And if we don't get to them live, we will get you answers in follow-up. So Allison, good morning to you as well. And so Jenny, let's start off. You found a great quote about performance management. And I think we'll just share it here right now about, you know, managing a colleague's performance through an annual conversation is like managing your marriage through your anniversary. It's probably a really interesting place to start. This whole concept of performance management, performance appraisals, a once a year meeting, or if you're, you know, still in the early stages of your marriage, you maybe celebrate an anniversary every month and you just do your performance appraisal more frequently. So where do you want to go from here? This is, you know, there's a lot of meat we can get into when we start talking about performance. And I think this is going to be a fascinating conversation.
It's definitely one that we probably don't have enough time for this morning. Where do we want to go from? So Mind Jim's quote nails it beautifully. The sort of most basic is we still have some people who have that once a year annual conversation. And it doesn't matter where you go, everybody dislikes it. In fact, it's really rare that someone likes that annual conversation. Some companies, as you said, they've got better, maybe 4 conversations a year, and they're celebrating that that's the fact. Then we have these performance management systems. And as you can see on the screen here, one of the pieces here is your performance management system rarely raises performance. And so we spend billions on these systems that don't actually achieve what we want them to achieve. And then we have the whole individual piece. How do you have that conversation when it's time to have that conversation? So to answer your question, where do we want to go? Maybe a good place is to start with the difference. Like, what are we actually measuring? I think that's one of the pieces that sort of leaves people a little bit unstuck.
Sure. Yeah, and it's interesting. You know, I've been in a situation now for the first number starting to close in on a 2. The number of years that I've been doing performance appraisals and working with systems and seeing the changes over time, and going from systems where you had very strict, you know, this objective is worth X%. And if you get a 4 on this, it's X% times the 4, and then you add it all up to see what your number is at the end of the year. And so, you know, and coming from a lot of sales background, you know, we've always had that conversation of, you know, if you don't hit your number, should you even be getting a good performance appraisal, right? And so, you know, there's something in there for me around the whole piece of, you know, what is performance versus the thing that's always bothered me about performance appraisals is that you're sitting down and having a conversation about results.
Yeah.
So like, are results and performance the same thing, or are results the outcome of performance? What are your thoughts on that one?
A couple of things, of course. Number one, when you just described all those numbers times 4 down the list, add it up, makes a total, you actually sounded like you knew how it worked. And that's
Math is simple.
You're talking to someone who's allergic to numbers. But the scary piece, first off, is that when we talk about these conversations, managers, leaders, whoever they might be, actually don't know how it all works. And so to start with, the conversation has been split differently. We'll come back to that, I'm sure. I think the important piece you're talking about there is the difference between performance and results. And it's that important that I do have a slide for that one, because I thought that might come up. And so when we look at performance, and got to have that one of those gold medal, we've got lots of medals now since I found this photo. Lots of people don't like the sport analogy, but it's a good one to use. Is the difference between performance and results is almost exactly how you put it. Results are the what. You're always going to have results. So in sales, those numbers, whether they hit where you want or not, that is your result. The question is, what gets you to that result? So if the result is the what, then the performance becomes the how. So your performance is the input that leads to, maximizes even that result. The problem is we often hang all the weight on the result. So the end there is you could have a really phenomenal performance, but not quite hit that number. What happens then? You can have a really unethical, dodgy performance and hit the number. What do we reward then? So I think the way you put it is right. Results are the cap, that's the what, and the performance is the how that leads to it.
Yeah, April in the chat here just talked about sales performance. And sales performance and sales are not the same. There's always external forces that can impact it. And April, you're absolutely right. You could have a phenomenal year from a sales representative perspective, but have something like COVID hit, right? And your results just change drastically. Jenny, to your point, I've been on teams and seen teams with the lone wolf who goes off and does whatever they need to do to get the number, and they have a fantastic result, but they're leaving a wake of destruction behind them. And so it's interesting. And where I saw some of that change in my career is all of a sudden we had all the objectives that we were measuring, and somebody went, hold on, there has to be more focus on the quality or how we're doing this. And the values system of the organization was now, how are we measuring you against your values? Here's how you do your job. And so now you're getting a rating on your integrity, a rating on this, a rating on that. And it just was the mathematical formula again, add them together. And so really interesting piece on that one. Mark has a question here, and maybe we'll get to this through the conversation or right now. And I apologize, my window is open. You probably just heard that truck blower down the street. But what's your favorite system? Your favorite performance management system?
Mine personally?
It's in the chat, or it's a Mark's question. So yeah, I'm gonna throw it to you.
So it's a good question. Thank you, Mark. None, actually, in terms of the old way that we talk about performance management. And this is where it gets just a little bit tricky in the conversation, because when we say none, it sounds like one of those fluffy free-for-alls, and this is not fluffy. We have to hold people accountable. We have to know where we're going. If you do nothing, you'll go somewhere. Just might not be where you intended to go. It might be backwards even. So we need to have accountability. We need to have those performance conversations. We've got to be aligned on where we want to go. And so when I say none, I think the piece that I would do is separate the performance conversations from the earnings, the revenue, the money piece to it.
Or whatever your results may be.
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. And you know, we were talking last time about collaboration. And so we're moving into this innovative, collaborative world. If we're going to do that, that's a social process. That's people together. And that's one of the big problems with these performance management systems is they rate us individually. So Craig, you and I are on the same team.
Mhm.
And there's one, we had the slide with it earlier, and there's that bell-shaped curve. Right, well, if we're running by a bell-shaped curve, only one of us is up for promotion or up for the bonus or whatever that might be. And
Yep,
you'd like
yep.
us to work together. That's an interesting one to manage as a leader. It's really difficult.
Yeah. Or I've seen systems which say, you know, we can only have 55% of the organization as 4s and 5s, right? The remainder have to, you're actually forcing the distribution on the organization, regardless of what those performance results may be, right? And so what an even stranger constraint to put on the fact that you could have a team. Maybe you've got a team of 5s, but the system says no.
And let's take a moment here and two things. I'm pretty sure, here we go, I did. This is really, really important, I think, when we start to talk about performance in the workplace. So what we need to remember, especially if you're a leader in here, your team is made up of people. So generally people care. If I have a job, I care about the job. It's really, really rare that people don't care. Secondly, I'm an adult in a job. And so first off now, especially if I have a job, I have applied, which means that I have been in those hundreds of people who have applied. I've probably got through 3 interviews. We've been weeded out. I've been hauled over the grills. We've made sure our values match everything that we've done possible. So I kind of want to be here if I've been through that process. And then once I've got that job, that I've been through that whole rigmarole, I want to do my job. But then we talk about those forced rankings and those pieces. Remember, we care. And I work as hard as I can. That's an interesting mindset. What if everybody is doing the best they can? And then, I'm sorry, you can only be a 3. And that's really difficult for some people to add those 2 together. So as a leader, if you have that system, that's an interesting piece to manage, because Craig, you've worked your heart out this year. You've done really well. You've gained some extra clients, relationships, whatever that piece may be. But you're only just meeting it. You get a 3. But please do the same again next year.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's another really interesting conversation too, because as I progress through some of these systems, you then have to the organization starts resetting the expectations on the fact that meeting expectations is a good thing, right? You're coming to work and doing the job we asked you to do, but here's your seat, right?
Yeah.
Right. And so your comment around these are adults that are coming to work wanting to do a good job, for the most part, they've all graduated some school of some sort at some point, yet we insist on still providing grades to them when they start working. Like what an interesting situation. There's a few questions that have come in here. And so Adrian, you have one in the chat. I think it's a really important one. Is it possible to foster collaboration in system work that has a forced ranking distribution?
Yes. Can I stop there? No, that's not fair. Yes, it is. I think we have this situation in a lot of places where you can't necessarily, you can't be part of that conversation for some reason. And I'm sure we'll get there later. Performance management is a legacy from the early 1900s. Like why we're still sticking to it, that whole parental piece, especially the ones where come in and all we're going to talk about is your weaknesses. We'll get there later. The collaboration piece, Adrian, in there, I think it's got to be separate. I think if your company's not ready to go there, don't tie it to that piece unless you can tie the competency pieces. So Craig, you were talking earlier about the integrity and those kind of values, competencies, the how we do it. That might be something that you can measure from there. But I think there has to be an open conversation with your team if that's the way that your company is set up, the way the culture is set up. And we often see companies that want to do an overhaul on their culture.
Mhm.
And if you're going to do that, you have to do an overhaul on your performance management as well, because how you measure has to align with how you want your employees to behave.
Yeah. Well, and I would also say how you compensate your teams as well. And,
Yep.
and I know, before I came to SAID, I spent a number of years in pharmaceuticals, and there's been a significant shift in that industry from this very individual based, performance based, here's your individual bonus plan, to, you know what, we're taking individual bonus plans right out of it, and we're going to a company goal. If the company meets its number, everybody comes along with it. So, I think you raise a really interesting point in that if you want to foster collaboration and teamwork, all of it needs to align. You can't have one piece in that machine that is somewhat out of whack with the rest of it. So,
Absolutely.
couple other questions here I want to get to. Knowing that ideally the performance management system should be non-existent, what are your thoughts on holding leaders accountable for having those conversations?
Yes. I am stuck. That's the theme for today. Yes.
Yes.
Yes. And this is the piece that goes missing, and it goes missing because it's hard. Like, if we have to have there's a reason they're called difficult conversations, because they are difficult. And I've spoken to VPs who would rather take a sick day than have the conversation that they need to have. And almost as a rebound, again, goodness knows how many years ago came that nasty sandwich. Well, we'll talk about nice, and then we'll talk about what we need to, and then we'll talk about nice. We don't need that. Just have the conversation. So I think for leaders, the accountability is absolutely there. It doesn't work if those conversations aren't happening. But the other key piece, performance management isn't something that we do to people. And we often think of it that way. It comes from HR, and then the leaders have to do this, and we get people chasing timelines and all the rest. Performance management in an ideal world is something that we do with people.
Yeah.
And the minute we change that one single word, now we're both responsible. And that's when it becomes easier, because it becomes very real for me to say, Craig, I need some feedback on XYZ. There's the conversation opener, even to the point of, Craig, I'm going to look for some time in your calendar. I'd love to have a conversation about this. And now we've got that two-way piece as well. So
absolutely. And that ties back to some of the earlier conversations we had around psychological safety on your team, and how do you enable your team to do that. I'm glad you brought that point up, though, because one thing that I've always struggled with in my career is, to your point, that performance management discussion always seems to be the top down, or from the leader to the employee. And how do you foster that piece where the employee, or the one being appraised in that situation, does have a role and responsibility to also play, right? To your point, it's a two-way street. So if we're setting up systems such that we're looking to hold leaders accountable to have those conversations, how do you also create the environment where you're holding the employee accountable to participating in those conversations?
So what if we're all adults and we have a conversation about just that, and then we stick to it, and we revisit it, and we keep the conversation going? And the other piece too for leaders, let's just make this easy. The best way to have a performance conversation is to stop talking. And so when people are in this situation, often it raises your anxiety. Okay, you're going against the grain. There's a chance that you might not be liked for a little while afterwards. There's a chance that you may not be in control. It just goes on. It goes against what we want.
Yep.
And so what happens is, and often, or especially if you've been promoted because you are really good at your job, you know the job, which is great, but it also gets in your way because something happens. Okay, so let's say I go off the rails, something happens, and we have to have that performance conversation. Everything normal would suggest, okay, you know the job, you know why that happened, and you know how it can be fixed. So now the performance conversation is, in comes Craig, blah, 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 blah. Jenny sort of half nods, yeah, okay,
That was probably very accurate too.
And we move on. But when we stop and think about it, whose job is it? Who made the mistake?
Yep.
And whose career is it? Who's moving on? So therefore, why aren't I talking? Why are you talking? And why aren't I talking? And even that simple shift helps to change the conversation. But the problem with that is you have to give me control of the conversation.
Yeah.
And that might go somewhere that you didn't plan on.
No, 100%. So, Allison, I hope that answered your question. That spurred a bit of a conversation there. Just drop us a note in the chat if it did. Here's another is, what process would you recommend to help engage someone in improving their performance if they disagree with the assessment or refuse to engage in the process?
We always knew this was going to be a juicy conversation.
Oh yeah.
So first off, when somebody disapproves, is against it, there's a conversation to have there, first of all. So when we resist, we've usually been let down before. What's going on there? And it may not be you. It might be one company before. It might be two companies before, but there's a resistance. Secondly, did they have any part in that appraisal? Like, where's the appraisal coming from? This is another place where we slip up a lot is, Craig, if you're rating or appraising or whatever for me, it's based on what you've seen from your perspective at the opportunities when you got the chance to see. Is that the full story? Yeah. No, there's no way it can be the full story. And so have they had a part in that appraisal? The other piece I would look at is, how often are you having this conversation? So we've two modes. One is the prescribed conversation, 1, 2, 4 times a year, maybe every other month if you're really shifting into this idea, or the continuous conversation. And when it's a continuous conversation, those big pieces become much, much smaller.
No, it's interesting. I've had a few of those in my career, and as I look back on them, you can tell as leaders, I think we've all either inherited team members or inherited teams or made hiring mistakes, and you end up with 1 or 2 folks through your career where you just, as somebody reporting to you, you just don't get along, right? You just don't. Lots of people can interview very well, but then you start to see them in role and you go, this frankly is somebody that isn't going to get it done, somebody that maybe I just don't like as a person. And then you really start to have that challenge of, how do you work through those scenarios where they just don't respect your opinion, you don't respect theirs, and you start getting into this conversation around performance, and it can spiral so quickly. They're challenging. They're really challenging situations.
They are, and I'm looking at my screen because there's a little thing here. Let's see if we can get there.
Okay.
Trust technology for a second. Nope, it's not working. Hold on 1 minute. Nope, still not working. Okay, let's just try one more time. There we go. That's the one I was looking for. So a couple of easy pieces to take away to make the conversation productive. Because if we go back to collaboration, Craig, we don't necessarily have to like everybody that we work with. No. We don't necessarily have to get on. We've got that diversity of thought piece. So that's key. The question is, how do we make this work? And so 3 things that we can actually get rid of, if you like, as quick as possible. The first is the phrase constructive criticism. Now, if you just stop and think, people like to use it a lot, but when you think about it for a moment, it's impossible. I'm going to be constructive and I'm going to criticize you. No, that's not going to work so well. So performance management isn't about criticism. If you're going in there for the squash or the win, stop, reset. You've got to come from a different angle. The second one there, and I know there's some people in our audience today who've heard me say this a lot. There's this phrase, put yourself in their shoes. How would I like to receive this? Now, it's better than nothing. It shows that you're thinking about the other person, but it's also absolute rubbish. You have no idea what it's like to be in my shoes. You can't even begin to think that you do. And so with those people, we've got to make the time. We talked about social capital, I think, every week we've been here. how do you get to know them? How do you get to know what's going on for them? What does it look like from their side? And then the third one, and I love this, is an acronym that I use a lot when we're in classrooms or Zoom rooms, whichever way we're working now. And it's the difference between being stuck in bed and grabbing the oars. So this being stuck in bed is blame, excuses, and denial. So the minute that we hear any one of those three, that conversation's in a downward spiral. We're going to get stuck. And so if you're working with someone and you're hearing one of those three, there's a great flag. We can stop right there and find out what's going on. The alternative, the oars, in order to move forward: ownership, accountability, responsibility. And if you make it plural, you can add for self there as well. And so I think, those three things, if we could sort of get rid of or temper or use those, the conversations would become a little bit more productive.
I think, Jenny, that's probably the first time I've heard you refer to either of those, stuck in bed or the oars. I love those. Those are fantastic. There's a handful of questions here I want to see if we can get to. As an employee with no additional reward possible, what is my incentive to perform at a high level? And I think I'm going to put a layer on this, is that I think this maybe is coming from the perspective of the performance rating being tied to that annual merit increase, or the rewards that go with it. So curious what are your thoughts on this one. It's a great question.
I actually think it's brilliant if the bonuses aren't attached, or the rewards aren't attached, because what we end up doing is rewarding, I don't know the right word, I was going to say rewarding the lazy. That might not be fair at all. But if we attach it all to that, then I'm going to create the easiest goals in the world. So I would pull those two apart first off. Absolutely. And to go back to the original question, it's about the conditions that are created. So science will tell us that there are 6 conditions that raise performance. And those 6 conditions are tied really tightly to intrinsic motivation. So money is extrinsic motivation. It was minus 19 in Calgary. I am not going to get up at 6 o'clock to get down to SAIT to be there on time just because I'm paid $1 or $2 extra. Nope, I'm going to do that because I care about the people that I work with and the conversations that I have. So in order to get to that latter piece, we need those conditions in place. And those conditions hover around knowing what the purpose is. Okay, what's the why? Why am I doing this? Am I involved in challenge? People love a good challenge. How we manage that is interesting, but there's a challenge piece in there. What choices are you making? And in the choices piece, this is where I would leave that performance review. Okay, we know what's happened. We need a performance preview. What are we going to do this year? What are we going to create in the next month or 2 months? What else? We need recognition. We need attention. And we need, and I can't remember the 6th one because I don't have them written down in front of me, but there's 6 conditions that create this performance piece. And so, if you don't have that sort of bonus available and you want to grab that motivation, take a look at what lights your fire, make sure it aligns to where the company, the team, the department goes, and then have the conversation. And it's a what if. What if I got 30% of my week to work on this to achieve this?
Yeah, and the other, to take it to the other extreme of that too, at some point there's maybe perhaps not a fit, right? If you're on a team where you're not looking forward to going in to do the work, if you're not accepting of the challenge that is presented, or you're not excited by it, or you're not looking to develop in your role, it might not be the right place for you anymore.
There's always a choice. Always.
There's always a choice, to your point. Some other questions here. What role do factors outside our control play in performance discussion, like a pandemic messing up the final results and the ways to do the job? How does one accommodate for such factors into a performance discussion? Probably a timely conversation over the past year or so.
Yeah, COVID was really good for us because beginning of 2020, everybody had everything in place, and 3 months in, hopefully those metrics, whatever else were being changed. So the conditions will always be the conditions. And I'm starting to talk more and more about this sort of overall look at performance management as a bit like a boat on the sea or a boat on the ocean. And you can't control the wind, the sun, the weather. So the conditions are always the conditions. The question is, to use a good saying, and I don't know whose it is, how do we adjust our sails to match those conditions? And the key in this is knowing, where do you want to go? Remember, we said if you do nothing, that boat will still move. If you overload it, it's going to sink. But if you've got that balance right, it's going to float.
Yeah.
It'll still move. But if you know where it is you want to go, then you have to readjust the sails to make sure you can get to where you want to go. I'm not sure I completely answered the question there, but.
No, I totally get where you're going, right? And I think it ties in well with another question that comes here is, do you agree that individual objectives should be flexible, changeable over the course of the year towards reaching the ultimate corporate key objectives, which can also change, right? And I think what I'm hearing you say there, if I can be so bold as to try and paraphrase, is that, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Right? As conditions are going to change, right? If we are so rigid as to think, okay, whatever our performance cycle is, January 1st, here's our objectives for the year. And magically come December 31st, we've achieved them all, or we haven't achieved them, or we've achieved some. But January 1st the next year, we're going to set them all again. And we're not going to change course through. I don't know how many teams can succeed by not being flexible and not adjusting. I think where the challenge probably comes in for leaders is, how do you then have the conversation around an employee coming in and saying, yeah, I want to change my objectives again, just because it'll be easier, versus there's real reason behind why the objectives need to be changed.
We're right back to adult conversation. Hey, there's a flag. What's going on? Maybe there's something huge going on in their lives, in which case that's a great conversation. Maybe this is harder than I thought it was, and I'm not getting the support that I need. Those challenge goals, those stretch goals, the research behind them shows we love a good challenge and we're prepared to dig in and work hard, but that feedback support from the leader has to come regularly. So frequent, I think the term put it, frequent and lightly. We're talking every 2 weeks at least, some kind of feedback, conversation, support piece going on. And so, yes, it's a good conversation to have. What makes us want to change those? And a couple of other things in that you said there so we've got these KPIs, a lot of people call them, and we're not meeting the KPIs. Fantastic. Key performance indicator. It's showing us that something's happening that isn't allowing us to go where we thought we could go. That's a better conversation than you're not making it this month. Yeah. And then the numbers there are horrible. Like, I think if we have a negative conversation, okay, Jenny, your scorecard is all red. Sucks to be you. My performance actually goes down for something like a week or 3 days. I can't remember the actual number. It's nasty. So by leaning in on that red, a little bit of shame and blame in there, maybe, you just drop my performance for the next few days. And now how am I going to get back there? You're in the end of the day, I'm going to use you, haven't even helped yourself because you've now stuck me into a slump as well.
Yeah, it's an I've never thought of that side of it before too, because, and again, I come from a very narrow perspective of sales teams after sales team after sales team, where truly you're, 90% of what you're doing is about the number, right? Yeah. Meet the number. And especially when you're working in public companies where you've got that quarterly call, that's a very different conversation altogether, because now we're really trying to manage to objectives that are being measured by analysts sitting back in some corner bank in New York. A very different conversation. But I think if you're an organization that is not going to be flexible in how you're progressing and what goals you're aiming for, I think you're not going to set yourself up very well. So we covered a couple of questions there. So Vis and Karen, if those hit the answers for you, please just drop us a note in the chat and let us know. Simon has a interest. I was going to ask you this as well. Performance previews.
Yeah.
That's an interesting concept. Can you tell us more about what this looks like, please?
Yes. Yeah, that's a good word for today, isn't it? Yes. So
Yes.
Classically, we've always gone performance review. So when we've had those prescribed conversations, which are nasty, let's face it, we're looking at a checklist.
Yeah.
We both kind of scantily look through beforehand, and then we file when we're done. And when we look in a performance review, really, we know what's happened. And if as a leader, you haven't dealt with the things that went wrong at the time they went wrong, okay, that's a loss. And if we haven't celebrated the things that were great when they were great, well, then we've kind of missed a piece there. So do what you have to do for the prescribed piece that's laid on you. But the exciting piece is the performance preview. Remember, when we come into this conversation, if you're my leader, Craig, my career stands in your hands from my perspective at that point. And so if we talk performance preview, the conversation is around, Jenny, what do you want to do this year? Now, there's always the day job. Don't get me wrong. I have to do my day job. I've got this set of accountabilities, responsibilities, got to get those done. But where do you want to go? What do you think we can achieve? Will that be challenging enough? And that's where the conversation starts from. And together, we look forward. Now, you can do that preview as a one-on-one. You can do a team preview. You can break it into different places. It all has to align with where you want our team to go. Okay, this isn't about a free-for-all, Jenny, go create this and have a laugh. No, 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 no. It's got to align with what you want. Yeah, but now I have ownership in that piece. And with that conversation earlier, how am I motivated? If I have ownership, I am much more likely to take that goal, objective, whatever it might be, and run with it because it's mine and I like it. And then I often say, you know, when we're in the classroom, we're talking about goal setting and all those pieces. If you write a goal down on a piece of paper, where you want to go to, okay, this is where we could go if we drift. This is where we could go if we really tried hard, if we put our minds to it. If you write that down and it doesn't, just light a fire like that, start again. Because we're too busy, the jobs are too hard, they're too stressful. To take something on that you just puts a sour taste in your mouth, it's not going to work so well. So it's about connecting with the passion, what drives us, what led us here.
Yeah, and I think that's a conversation so many leaders, well, I think there's a bell curve of leaders, right? You're gonna have ones out in the front end that have those conversations about getting down to what drives people, what their passions are, how they want to be recognized. And then you're gonna have a big group in the middle who are really just, holding on, trying to keep their nose above water and trying to meet the company objective, right? They're sandwiched in the middle between demands from above, supporting their team below. And it's tough. Like, it's not a simple thing to do to be the leader driving that ship. So yeah, really interesting. Mark's got a great question here that I think could be a conversation in and of itself. But if you had to start from scratch in terms of performance management, where or what would your first steps be?
That's a great conversation.
Yeah. And we're out of time. No, carry on.
So where would you start? Well, you have to start with the sort of foundation. So we have to know where we want to go to. That's the key, because if it doesn't align to the company, it's a waste of time and money again. And then we have to I would actually look at those conditions that we talked about and how do we bring them in for every team? And is that feasible? And Craig, I think I'm going to stop there because we could talk for hours on this one. And I'm happy to lean in somewhere else. Yeah. I think it's the mindset. To go back to Mark's original question, I think the first piece is, do the leaders throughout, whether you're flattened or hierarchical, do you have buy-in throughout as to either this is going to change or we're a brand new company, we're starting from scratch, this is how we see it. And there's time and there's conversation in there, lots of it.
Yeah, and I think I'll take it even higher too. If you're going to start from scratch, I think maybe you need to start thinking about how are you writing your job descriptions, right? What kind of roles are you putting in place? How are you hiring, right? If you hire right, a lot of the performance discussion becomes more, to your point, Jenny, about what are the passions of people and how do we start drive things. If you're not hiring right, you're going to have a lot of different performance discussions. How do you onboard your people? How do you train them? How do you, to your comment I want to come back to earlier, because I think a lot of leaders probably went, when you said performance conversations every couple of weeks, how am I going to build time in for that in my schedule? Have you seen my calendar? Every 2 weeks you want me to have a conversation with somebody? So let's touch on that one a bit, because sometimes we make way too big a production. It's not the right phrase, but we make it bigger than it is, right? So how do we, maybe if you can, and we'll kind of go from this and close with our normal, but what are your thoughts around what do those conversations need to look like? Like, this is not a half-day event every 2 weeks.
No. So it's what we call a continuous conversation. And virtually it's harder because we're set up to book half hour for that conversation. When we're working face to face, they do become a quicker conversation. So that's a piece to think about, is it possible to book just 10-15 minutes? And I think it was in the meetings, our very first breakfast conversation, where we talked about that reverse meeting block time. So there's time when I can drop in, or you can drop in and chat with me, 5-10 minutes. So it's a continuous conversation. And it happens more timely, it's specific. So really, if you're paying attention as a leader, you'll know when those conversations need to happen. And if I'm working on a real challenge with 2 or 3 people, we might be talking more during that phase than we are later in the year, where I'm perhaps less concentrated on that area. So this isn't to say, Craig, you've got to put me in your calendar every 2 weeks. But it is to say that we need to pay attention and remember what we talked about at the beginning too. This isn't all you. This is on the employee as well. It's my job to say, I need some feedback. Is there somewhere where I can get 10 minutes, please? And then open that conversation as well.
Yeah. It is such a discipline that a leader needs to be able to have, to really focus on making that part of their regular cadence of operation, right? And it's, I go back to earlier conversations we had around meetings. I'm a huge fan of time blocking. Block time in your, it may seem contrived, but block time in your calendar to, look at team recognition or individual check-in, or, April in the chat here, it can be as simple as a check-in.
Yeah.
How are you doing? What can I do to help? Great conversation starters. So there's another handful of questions here, folks. I'm not sure we're going to be able to get to them all, but I'm going to grab one more. We will get the answers out to those that we don't get to live here. What if the team member doesn't have any goals? That team member is with the organization for many years, and their common feedback is to continue whatever they are doing. So I think this for me is one of those, we've all inherited the 3 that maybe is a 2, but they've continually come along. And Sai, if that's kind of where you're going with this one, maybe just drop me a note in the chat. But again, it's how do you, I think, work with that employee who's been there for some time.
Okay, I get asked this a lot actually when we're doing performance management. And often it's applied to those who have 1 or 2, 5 years left in their job, and they simply want to do their job. They don't want to have a part in any of this new stuff that's going on. So my first question is, are they meeting your expectations? Are they doing the job? And if the answer is yes, and you're sure you've had that conversation, so you've you kind of lent in a little bit and dug in there to, you know, why they don't want to take anything on, why they don't want to do extra. And they understand if there's a consequence to that, if you are tied to money, and they understand that piece, they've got to understand the big picture. If they are sure, then let them do their job. If they're meeting the expectations and getting it done, and they can't or they don't want to take anything else on.
Yeah. And if they're not distracting or dragging the team down,
that's important.
Yep. Right. Why rock the boat?
Absolutely.
We all need, every team needs those. It's not the, again, bad. It's not a great phrase, but every team needs those workhorses who are going to come in and do their job and contribute. And that may be what they want.
Yes. And I think that the important piece is that's not a one and done conversation. So we do need to check in through the year. Are they still at the same place? Is that where they're still sitting? Are they happy with that? That's our accountability right there. Yeah. And the other piece too is that doesn't mean that they don't get any recognition or attention, because if you've got someone like Jenny, there's yes, let me do the exciting stuff. I want to do this big challenge and I can still do my bit of my day job here. So Jenny, recognize you can do this because Joe here is doing this. So they deserve equal recognition. That's their place within their team. It's the tapestry of the team. And there's an interesting piece you mentioned earlier, job descriptions. And be tempted to get rid of them. That's a really bold thing to say on here, but the minute you write a job description and I arrive at a job, the job description is almost done. Like it just morphs and changes all the time. So as a team, what do we need to do? Where do we need to go? Let's just assign that regularly so that people get that choice. That was one of the conditions, and can, I'm going to say, play where they want to play, because we spend so many hours at work. We must be doing what we like most of the time.
Yeah, very good. All right, we're a couple minutes over. Jenny, I think as usual, we'd like to close with one big idea, a couple strategies for folks to take away, and some questions that you can ask yourself around this topic. So I'll turn it over to you. Okay. And Christine, in your chat, yes, that's the word I was looking for. Those folks are the foundation. It's a much better comment than workhorse. So thank you for that.
There we go. Yeah. So our idea, we've already talked about this, but let's look at performance management, performance conversations as a with rather than something that we do to. It's a little bit parental when we come in with this, whereas when we're with, we meet on that even ground piece. I think we talked about that probably enough earlier. Yeah. The two sort of strategies, you can take these away straight away. They're more sort of remember points this week than physical things that you can do. This is a two-way conversation. So I think I phrased it earlier as stop talking. The posh version of that is what we call voice share. So in any performance conversation, you really want to be at a 50-50 voice share, 50% each. That's what conversation needs to look like. Craig, you mentioned it. We have to build trust and psychological safety. So if you sat there today thinking, oh, there's your starting point, build the trust and the psychological safety first. Are you as a leader asking for feedback too? That's a healthy thing to do. Yep. And then the key piece in this cadence, and you talked about it, we're all busy, super busy. The only failure that we can have here is not having the conversation. And so those 2 minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, they're really, really important. You struck something for me earlier, and I forget which company it is, but they created a deck of cards of conversation starters to help their leaders know how to start that conversation. But, the best deck sat on the desk and the employee chose the one that they wanted to start the conversation with as well. So that might be a good little trick in there. The second one, we didn't get into a recognition too much today, but we'll keep it in here as a sort of takeaway. Recognition is a really, really important piece. The sort of old version of performance management is that I'm managing poor performance. Actually, that performance piece, if I recognize the good work you're doing, the discretionary effort will go up. That conversation costs you nothing bar 5 minutes. The return on the discretionary effort could be huge, worth it. I think we've talked about clarity a lot. The problem in performance conversations is that we sketch. That's what the little cartoon on the side is about. Because we're anxious, because we don't want to hurt feelings, we don't get into the actual detail. So before you have that conversation, set your intention. Be really clear with yourself. That'll help you to be clear with the person you're talking to. We've talked about this before, I'm sure. Be ready for the conversation. Take a moment to set your own mindset. You're not going in for the win. You're going in for a conversation. And we could build on that one a lot. And then I love this sentence down here. I think it comes from Amy Cuddy. People behave badly when they feel powerless. So positional power, your leader title, messes this conversation up if you're not careful. So what are you doing to empower the other person in the conversation? So those are just a few things to think about as you head into these conversations. And then the questions, we always leave you with 3 questions. Probably sitting here this morning, there's a conversation that you need to have. When will you have that one? Where will you give back control is where will you stop talking? Because the minute that you stop talking, the other person gets control of the conversation, or perhaps it's controlling where they want to go. What are their great ideas? Have you had that conversation? And then you mentioned it, make time for the recognition. Are you there? And be really careful. Recognition's easy for the people that we like, who are on track, harder on the other side. So maybe we just check in that you've been.
Yeah, I'm thinking that recognition is going to be a future conversation that we have here, Jenny. So that's fantastic.
And that's me done, except to say we're back in Heritage Hall in September. So
absolutely,
have reached out to me in LinkedIn and said, what's going on in Heritage Hall? Those of you who've never been there, there's one of our original classrooms on the right-hand side. It's a long time since I've seen inside there. Craig always releases these PowerPoints. So this information will come to you, and this isn't all of it. It's a taster. I think we start September the 20th with delegation. And this doesn't include the performance management side, the supply chain, the train the trainer, with a ton of stuff going on, but we're here, or we will be there.
Excellent. And Tiffany, I see your question in the chat there. Will there be a virtual option? Yes, we do have some of the programming available virtual, some face-to-face. Certainly something that we can chat about for you to take a look at. We are back next Friday talking about September. And, you know, I'm a little selfish with this one, because I know we've got September looming large. We've got changes to how Alberta's approaching COVID. We've got kids going back to school. We've got students going back to school. We've got offices reopening, not reopening, partially reopening. There's a lot going on in September that I think could set up to be a really stressful month for leaders. We want to have a conversation around how we can help you really just be the best you can be in September and help your team the best you can. I think there's going to be a few areas that we cover, but I think it's an important one as you kind of wind down August to start thinking about, okay, what's September going to look like? And how can I, as a leader, really get my team in a great spot? So we'll be back then. As usual, if you are interested in having further conversation around programming, my team is here to help. We would love to work with your organization, chat with you about what we can do to bring Jenny or other great facilitators that we have to your organization to really take your team through some of these topics. So with that, I can also tell everybody that's left, Canada has won the gold medal in soccer. They won it on penalty kicks. So there you go. Have a fantastic weekend. And Jenny, I think that's it.
We're done. We squeezed it in there. I think we could do
go.
Many times.
Appreciate everybody joining us. Take care.
Thanks, everybody. Take care. Have a great weekend.
Bye-bye.